Good morning, and I'd like to say thank you for turning this on this morning. And before I start the lesson, I'd also like to say Happy Mother's Day to all of the mothers and the grandmothers and the mothers-to-be. Now, in our lesson today, we're going to continue in the study of Paul's letter to the Roman church. If you have this book, we're in session 11. If you don't have that book, then we're going to be from studying Romans chapter 12. Most people try to improve their lives. We want to. We make New Year's resolutions. Sometimes we stick to them for a week or more. We join the gym. Sometimes we go. Sometimes we don't. We go back to school sometimes to get a degree or to get a higher degree. We might change jobs, or many other things that you can name that would help people to improve their lives. And that's a good thing. It's not bad. The efforts that we make to make a better life for ourselves is not a bad thing, unless these activities replace the kind of change that is most needed in our lives. And that kind of change would be a spiritual transformation. That's not a change that we can do on our own. It's one where we need God to change the inside of us so that it shows on our daily lives. So in our chapter in Romans, chapter 12, Paul is going to switch from building the theology and the foundation of the gospel that he's been teaching to the readers in Rome, and he's going to turn now to the practical usage of it, how we live it out in our daily lives, which is really very important. So we go over to verses 1 and 2, and he says, I beseech you. And that is a strong encouragement. It is a strong request. He's going to ask them to do something. I beseech you, therefore, and therefore connects what he's been teaching them about Jesus and about the new covenant that God has made. And what he's going to ask them to do now is based upon that. And he said, I beseech you, therefore, brethren. And to use the word brethren, that made a close connection between the readers and Paul, but it also made a connection between the readers and the readers, because the church was made up of the Jewish believers and the Gentile believers. And Paul had to work hard to get that unity within that body of believers. And he said, by the mercies of God, and he said that you present your bodies living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. In other words, he said, what I'm going to ask you to do is something that is reasonable for you to do because of what God has done for you, because of the mercies that God has given to us. And now when he used the word sacrifice, their ears probably perked up because they knew about sacrifices. A sacrifice system was built into the old covenant that God made with his people, and it was still active in the church at Jerusalem. So Paul's been teaching and talking against that old covenant, so I'm surely they kind of listened a little more intently when he used the word sacrifice. And the sacrifices that he's asking us to make are holy and acceptable unto God, and it's a reasonable thing that we should be able to do. So, but we're going to concentrate on the word living, a living sacrifice. Now, he said, make our bodies a living sacrifice. Now, that would be one that is alive as long as the person giving the sacrifice is alive. The sacrifices that were related to the old covenant, the bulls, the lambs, the rams, and for many of the poor people, the doves, they had to die and shed their blood in order to be given. But our sacrifice is one that lives. It is living a life that is devoted to the worship of our Creator. And I look around now at this season of the year, and you look at all the beauty in our world, in our earth, and just think about the Creator that created all of this and gave us stewardship upon it. And he said, the God who blesses us with mercy. And let's talk about mercy. We have sinned and we deserve punishment, but God's mercy does not give us the punishment that we deserve. So he blesses us with mercy and with grace. Now, grace is giving us things that we really don't deserve. So worship Paul said, this is a reasonable thing that I'm asking you to do for all of this that God has done for us. Worship, however, is not just a place to go on Sundays, or Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, turn on the online streaming of worship services. He said, that's not the worship that we're talking about. We're talking about a living sacrifice, which means it is an active, consistent state of living under God's leadership. And that would be not just a few hours a week, not a few minutes in the morning so that we can check the box and say, well, I've done my devotion, or, it's not for that. It is the way that we live daily in our lives. And then you might think, well, how can we accomplish that? Because life goes on, life happens, things happen. We're not perfect. We're human. We make mistakes. And here's what Paul said. He said, the way that you do that in verse 2 is, and be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your minds, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. God has a will for us. It's a good will. It's a perfect will. His will is perfect and it's acceptable. He said, so we're going to not conform to the world, and we are going to be transformed so that we can show what is our good God. Now, by not conforming to the world, you've probably seen people, I've seen it a lot in all the years teaching young people, where one person doesn't really do their own thinking. If they're with one group of friends, they agree with them. And then they get with another group of friends, and what they think or how they act might be entirely different, but they agree with them. That is conforming. It's an outward action. But he said, what we don't want to do is be conforming. Now, it might be, we may think, okay, well, there's a whole list of things that I've got to look, and I'm going to say, okay, I don't do that, you don't do that, you don't do that, you don't do that. And we don't want to get involved in doing in activities that are sinful or considered wrong. But not conforming to the world is more like a list of things that you do participate in. Here's what not conforming to the world means. It comes from within, this transformation, because our heart and our minds change, and it changes about the way that we think about things, our attitude, the way that we react to situations, our actions, our words. It is, and here's an example, loving your enemy. The world generally does not do that. It is forgiving when you've been hurt. Maybe someone doesn't even say they're sorry, but you forgive when you've been hurt. The world generally doesn't do that, because the world would say, well, you get them back, you retaliate. It's showing kindness to people who appear to be ungrateful or selfish. And these actions that we can do is an example of not conforming to the world, because that's not the kind of activities that the world generally is involved in. So we go over now, and he skipped in this lesson verses 3 through 8, but I want to touch on that just a little bit, because it addresses the spiritual gifts that God gives to each of us. And I said each of us. That means every one of us. We talk about that a lot in my Sunday school class, because a lot of people think of a spiritual gift as something, it's a talent, it's playing an instrument, it's singing a song, it's doing this, it's doing that. A spiritual gift is not all that you can see. Everybody has one. He compared our church organization to our bodies. And just as each organ in our body has a different function, and they all work together, and if they're all working together in all that their potential is, then we have the benefit of a healthy, functioning body. But when just one little part fails to work to its potential or to do what its job is, then we probably end up seeing a doctor. And it doesn't have to be a big organ like your heart or your lungs. It can be a tiny, I've been to the doctor because my big toe hurt, but it hurt so badly and for so long that I thought, this is enough. I got to do something about it. Just one little tiny part. In fact, I was even had to see a surgeon one time because of a finger that hurt. And it was just a little pin spot on the end of my finger. And every time I touched it, it just bled profusely. That was not a big thing, but it was a problem, and I could not function with it. So I had to go see a doctor about it. Well, now, the church is made up of people, and all of these people have different gifts. And when you put all of these gifts together, then the church body becomes a unit of worship, which is really what the church body is supposed to be about. That's its intention, to be a unit of worship. But sometimes we don't use the gifts that God gives us. Now, I want you to think about how disappointing it would be. And I'm thinking of a parent who buys a gift for a child because of our father-child relationship with our God, our Father God. But you buy this gift and you've got it wrapped up so pretty, got a pretty bow on it. You give it to your child and they just take it and they set it aside. No interest in opening that gift. Or maybe they open the gift and then they just set it aside, and no interest in holding it. And it's something that you were really happy to give. Well, you take that disappointment that you feel and you multiply it by an exponential amount. And that's a math teacher term. You multiply your disappointment by an exponential amount, and you might get close to the disappointment that God feels when He gives each of us a specific gift, a spiritual gift, and we fail to use it. And we're not interested in it. We don't want to open it, or we open it and we set it aside and we don't use it. And when that happens, and we're not using that gift because God has put each person in a place with the gift that He's given them to function together. And now also, that's in our church unit, or in every church unit. God's church is made up of many church units. They're called Methodist. They might be called Southern Baptist. They may be called Missionary Baptist, Free Will Baptist, any kind of name that you might think of. Even in our little area here, we have many churches. We've got Cerro Gordo Baptist, we've got Cedar Grove Baptist, we've got Porter Swamp Baptist, Piney Forest Baptist. We've got all of these churches around, each one a little different from the other, but all studying the same doctrine, worshiping the same God. And he said God's church is made up of all of these units. And the reason I say this is because in the Roman church that this letter was sent to, it was made up of Jewish believers. It was made up of Gentile believers. There were some wealthy people in the church, and there were some poor people in the church, and there were some that were slaves. But Paul spent a lot of time trying to help them understand that not any single group, not any single group of people, not any single unit of church has a different separate status with God. All of us are on the same level playing field when we come to our relationship with God. The different believers in the church in Rome, the different units of churches in our area and all over the country and all over the world, we all are on the same status as God. So he skipped verses 3 through 8, or the writer of this lesson skipped verses 3 through 8. But when Paul finished addressing the different spiritual gifts in those verses, then he started to move on to specifically speak about love. And love is a spiritual gift too, because it's easy to love people that are our family, people that are our friends, but it has to go a little bit beyond that. So we go down to verses 9 and 10, and here's what Paul says about love. He said, let love be without dissimulation. That's the first thing he said. In other words, love is more than a pretense. Love is not, it's not hypocrisy. We're not loving you to your face and then we're doing something different or feeling something different when you walk away. It does not have ulterior motives. In other words, love is more of what you do than what you say. That's the kind of love he's talking about. And then the next part of it says, abhor that which is evil, cleave to that which is good. Now, the way that we can do this is reject what God rejects and embrace what God embraces, and that will allow us to walk in true love, in the spiritual love that Paul is talking about. And in verse 10, he says, Be kindly affectioned one to another with brotherly love. In other words, he's going to give us some qualities that show us how to live our lives and show what genuine love looks like. He said it's kindly affectioned, and it's to one another with brotherly love. In other words, we treat everybody like they're our family, because all of the people in all of the many churches around are our families. Paul referred to these as his brethren. They're like our families. Most of us would make a sacrifice for a sibling or a child or someone in our family. We would sacrifice, not that we'd sacrifice our life, I'm not saying that, but we would make a sacrifice to help one in our family. But he said, we've got to do that to all of the believers. And then he says, in honor, preferring one another. In other words, we're going to try to outdo each other in showing respect. Can you imagine what our world would be like if everybody showed respect to everyone else? There was a lady in our church that I know everybody remembers, that we all love, Miss Grace McClellan, and she summed it up in a 3-letter word. She said joy means Jesus, others, and then yourself, in that order. And that's exactly what Paul was talking about in this little bit of verse, scriptures right here. And then we go over to verse 11, and he says, not slothful in business. Now, our business, because he's talking about the church, our business is about doing God's will. And when he says the word slothful, he's talking about don't be slow, don't be lazy in doing it. I know you've probably seen the commercial where a sloth is drawing a line and people are supposed to guess what he's drawing. And of course he only gets a little bit of a line drawn. He was slow. A sloth is slow. But Paul said, don't be slothful in business. In other words, don't be lazy in fulfilling your responsibilities. Remember, the parts of the body, we need every little part to work together, and the different gifts of the church and responsibilities of the people in the church, we need all of the people to assume their responsibility in the body of Christ so that it can function as it should. And he said, be fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. In other words, we need to check our motives when we do something that is serving the Lord. Are we doing it because it's an obligation? Or are we doing it because it's something that we want to do because of the mercy and grace that God has shown to us? And when he said be fervent, he said be enthusiastic in your service to God and to others. Now, we're going to stop for just 1 second and remind that good works are not the way to salvation. Paul's already talked about how you have salvation. He's saying all of this will come about because of your salvation. It's the result of it, because remember he said, I beseech you to do this based on the mercies of God, based on what God has done for you. So in verse 12 he says, rejoicing in hope. A few weeks ago our lesson spoke about hope. He said the Christian life is marked by joy. And, that peace that passes understanding regardless of our circumstances. We can't walk around now in the way that we are in the world and be angry about our situation. What we're going to do is we're going to do the best that we can with the situation that we have. We're not going to dwell on what we don't have and what we can't do. We're going to dwell on what we can do and what we do have. And he said when you are rejoicing and you have that joy, it comes about because of the hope. He said rejoicing in hope. And a few weeks ago when hope came up, we found out it's not just a fleeting wish. It is a confident expectation of what God is going to do, because we can base that on what God has already done. We've seen what God has already done. So the hope that we have is based on our confident expectation in what God will do. And then here's another one that came up a few weeks ago, patient in tribulation. We are not naturally a patient group of people. We want when we want what we want it when we want it. We wanted it yesterday. We'll take it today but maybe we won't get it until next week. We want that. He said, be patient in your tribulation. It's not natural, but if we can embrace some patience, then we can withstand the difficulties that we face a whole lot easier. And here's what might make that easier too: continuing instant in prayer. We have to persevere in our prayer, and it helps us to develop that patience that we need to withstand the trials and the tribulations or the difficulties in our life. But that doesn't mean just pray once and say, okay, I prayed today, Lord, I can check that box off. I've done that. I'm doing everything that you asked me to do. I've prayed, I've read the Bible, I've done my devotion, and I can check, check, check. It's not just that. We need to pray to God like our children do to us. Mom, can I go play with my friend? No, you can't go. And then a minute later, but can I go play just for a little while? No, you can't go. But can they come over here and play with me for a little while? No, we can't. It's not playtime. We need to be persistent. You know that saying, the squeaky wheel gets the worm, so we gets the grease. When you pray to God, you don't just pray one time and say, okay, God, I've prayed about this and he didn't answer it. If it's something that's on your heart and in your mind, you're going to pray consistently. In other words, our prayers have to be a use of our time and our energy. We're going to invest time and energy in our prayers. And then in verse 13, he says, distributing to the necessity of saints. Well, the saints he's talking about would be the people who are teaching and we pay our preachers. That's what we're supposed to do. We have to take care of the saints. We are the stewards and the keepers of what God has blessed us with. Each one of us has blessings. We might say, well, I've had a job. I've worked all my life for this. Well, you worked all your life because God allowed that to take place in your life. The blessings that he has given to us are his. He just allows us to use them while we're here on this earth. We are the keepers. We are the stewards of it. And he wants us to share the blessings. We participate in meeting the needs of other believers, because we don't own what we have. We just get to use it, and we get to be stewards and overseers of it. And then he also said, given to hospitality. Now, when Paul wrote this letter, it was very important that people were hospitable, because when the apostles, when the missionaries went from place to place, it's not like they could go rent a room at a hotel. There were some places where they could stay, but most of the time they were too expensive and maybe not safe for them to stay. And they were really dependent upon the people that they traveled to speak with and to teach, to provide them with food and lodging and a place to stay. But he said, not that they come up and ask for it, given to hospitality. He says he wants you to share your blessings, your monetary blessings, or any other kind of blessings. In this area, people are very good about, when they have garden, they share with everybody. And that's good. That's what God wants us to do. But also the hospitality and he said, don't just wait for it, but you go out and look for a way that you can be hospitable and how you can share. In Matthew chapter 25 and verse 40, Matthew's speaking about Jesus, and he said what he's going to say. Oh, let me read that. He says, the king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. And sometimes we're ministering to people, and we might be ministering to an angel unaware of us. And Paul said, that's what hospitality is about. You don't just wait for someone to ask you. Go out and you look for ways that you can share your blessings, that you can be hospitable to others. Now in verses 4 and 15, he's touching on how we interact with people outside of the body of believers. Now, all of this was about how we react with people that within our realm, but now he's going to talk about how we interact with people outside of the body of believers. And that gets maybe a little bit tougher. In verse 14, he says, bless them which persecute you, bless and curse not. In other words, You pray for those people. You pray that God will be gracious in their lives instead of asking God to punish them. Now, how is that not conforming to the world? That we're going to pray that God would bless someone who persecutes us. Now, in their time, there were Christians that were persecuted. Remember, Paul was very good at doing that before he met Jesus on the road to Damascus. And he said also, rejoice with them that do rejoice, and weep with them that weep. When someone has a fortune, when something good happens in someone's life and they're happy, they're rejoicing, we're to rejoice with them. We're not to feel a little tinge of envy or jealousy. That's what the world would do. But we are to rejoice with them. This Christ-like love that we show has to show some sensitivity to the joys of others and also to the sorrows of others. We're going to stand and we share in their feelings. We're in this world together. We're in this life together. We do life together. If something good happens for someone, we're going to be happy with them. If something makes a person sad or sorrowful, we're going to share in that sorrow. In verses 16 through 18, he says, be of the same mind one toward another. Now, you know, we don't always agree with each other. But what we must do is disagree in a way that we're sensitive to the needs of others. And I'm going to tell you a story that I've used many times in Sunday school over the years. There was a small church, and out on the outside of the church, when it was built, a tree was planted. And the church had grown, and the tree was large, and it needed to be moved in order to have space for parking. And there was one elderly gentleman in the church who was probably there, maybe helped plant the tree. He did not want that tree taken down. But the church voted, and they decided that the tree had to be taken down. So they all get together on Saturday morning, and that's their task. They're going to take that tree down. Well, this elderly gentleman that voted against moving the tree or removing the tree showed up to help do the work. And one of the other members said, well, I thought you didn't want this tree to come down. And he said, well, I didn't, but the church voted to take it down, and I'm a part of the church. And that's the kind of being of the same mind that we need to have one toward another. And then he said, mind not high things, but condescend to men of low estate. Be not wise in your own conceits. In other words, get rid of your pride. Get rid of the pride. No group or no person is on a different status with God. We are all on a level ground when it comes to our relationship with God. And he said, don't put yourself on a pedestal and think that you're better than anyone else. And in fact, he said, in order to get rid of pride, the antidote of that is to move yourself and go among the people that are less fortunate than you, those of low estate. And he said, recompense to no man evil for evil. Now, he's already mentioned that about our attitude. But in other words, it's important enough that he said it again. Forego that attitude of retaliation. If somebody does something bad to me, I'm going to do something bad to them. Maybe something worse. He said, don't do that. Recompense no man evil for evil. And then he said, provide things honest in the sight of all men, if it be possible, as much as lieth in you. And this is the important part. As much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Think about the welfare of others. Remember that word joy. Jesus, others, and then yourself. Now, we can't control the actions or the attitudes of another person. And sometimes people are very negative and they're disagreeable. I know you probably know somebody. They're just a disagreeable person. If you say the sun is shining, they're going to disagree with you. But Paul says this. He says, as much as lieth in you, live in peace. While we can't control others, we do have complete control of ourselves. We have complete control of our attitudes, our words, and our actions. That might bring us back to the bracelets that were very popular a few years ago. WWJD, what would Jesus do? Paul said, as much as it is possible with you, you keep the peace as much as you can, because we're in control of ourselves. Now, this comes to the part of the lesson that where we can take a look and an evaluation, and we can apply it to our lives, because that's what this lesson is all about, is how we live out daily in our lives and show our salvation. It's not hard for us to be kind to people that we love and who love us and who are compatible with us and who agree with us. But the real test comes when we start interacting with those who don't agree, who are not so compatible to our wishes. Maybe they're not putting us first. Maybe their joy didn't put Jesus and then others and then themselves. That's when it tests our ability to live as God would lead us to live. So what we need to do in our self-evaluation now is to review all of these guides from Paul's letter in today's lesson and think about, did any of them address you? Are you good at some, or do you struggle with some? And those that you're good at, pray that you get better. And those that you struggle with, pray that you get better. And just take this time to evaluate ourselves and how we interact with everyone around us. And I want to thank you for listening to another week. Remember, this week puts us one more week closer to being able to be back together and worship in person. I don't know when that will be, but this week puts us closer. And I thank you, and I hope that you'll keep all of us, the church, the country, keep them in your prayers. And remember, those prayers take time and energy. They're consistent prayers, not just a fleeting one so that we can check off the box and say, well, I prayed today. But when we pray and talk to God and listen to God. And I pray that you will keep safe and keep praying.